The road to the monastery was not marked on any map. It slithered through the dense, mist-choked forest like a forgotten scar, its cobbled stones worn smooth by centuries of unseen travelers. There were no signposts, no indicators that the path led anywhere at all, only an unspoken understanding among those who found it that something waited at the end. For the 5 travelers who made their way along it now, the silence was suffocating, as if the very trees leaned in to listen. Each had come for different reasons, though none spoke of them. Daniel, a historian, had traced obscure references to the monastery in ancient texts, each one more contradictory than the last. Eleanor, a journalist, had received a letter, a cryptic invitation signed only with the symbol of an open eye. Father Thomas, a weary priest, sought answers to a crisis of faith he had not dared confess. Lucia, a woman whose past was shrouded in secrecy, walked with a quiet determination that bordered on dread. And Gregory, an ex-soldier, carried a burden that no one but himself could see. As they walked, a soundless chill seeped into their bones, a cold that was neither from the air nor from exhaustion. The monastery, they had been told, sat atop the highest peak in the region, though no one in the nearby villages spoke of it willingly. The few who did would only warn, their voices hushed. You may enter, but the monastery does not easily let go of those who find it. When the first glimpse of the structure came into view, it was not what they had expected. There was no towering spire, no grand stone archways. Instead, the monastery was a squat, sprawling thing, its darkened windows like hollowed-out eyes peering from a mountainside. It did not loom, it waited. The great wooden gates stood ajar, as if anticipating their arrival. No monks came to greet them. No welcome was extended. Yet, something about the stillness suggested they were expected. Without speaking, they crossed the threshold. The doors closed behind them with a sound that was too soft for their weight, more like an exhale than the creak of aged wood. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wax and parchment, the light from tall candles flickering against vaulted ceilings. The architecture was an uneasy mix of styles, some halls lined with Gothic arches, others with bare stone that seemed to predate recorded history. The monastery had not been built all at once. It had grown, piece by piece, like something that had learned to adapt. A lone monk finally appeared, his robe a deep charcoal rather than the usual brown or black. His face was partially concealed by his hood, but his eyes were visible, sharp, intelligent, and far too knowing. He did not speak, but motioned for them to follow. The halls were unnaturally silent. Their footsteps did not echo, and even the faintest whisper felt swallowed before it could reach a listener. It was as if sound itself had been removed from the air, leaving behind a void where noise should have been. They were led to a communal dining hall where a long wooden table had been set, though no food had yet been served. Other monks sat there already, their heads bowed, hands folded, their silence not one of reverence, but of something else entirely, something heavier. It was then that Eleanor noticed it. Not a single monk had uttered a word. The silence was not a vow. It was something else, something deeper, something wrong. Would you like me to continue refining the atmosphere or add more detail to any specific part? The monastery's silence was absolute, yet it was not peaceful. It was not the sacred hush of devotion nor the meditative stillness of prayer. It was a silence that had weight, a silence that listened. Even as the travelers took their seats at the long wooden table, they felt its oppressive presence wrapping around them like unseen hands. The monks, seated in perfect stillness, made no move to acknowledge their guests. They did not eat. They did not drink. They did not glance at one another. They simply existed in that suffocating hush, heads slightly bowed, faces shadowed by the dim candlelight. It was Father Thomas who first noticed that none of them wore the simple wooden crosses customary of monastic orders. Their robes, too, lacked the traditional rope belts. There was nothing to indicate any religious affiliation at all. The travelers exchanged uneasy glances. A heavy, iron candelabrum flickered overhead, the only source of light in the cavernous dining hall. Shadows played along the stone walls, their shapes oddly distorted, as if shifting in ways they should not. The air smelled faintly of wax, dust, and something else, something metallic. The monk who had led them inside now stood at the head of the table. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate gesture, and as if responding to an unspoken command, two other monks emerged from the far side of the room. They carried trays laden with simple food, bread, cheese, and dark fruit. The monks moved without sound, their footsteps unnervingly light, as if they barely touched the floor at all. Gregory reached first, tearing off a piece of bread, but as he lifted it to his mouth, he hesitated. The others followed his gaze. Though the food looked ordinary, something about it fell off. Not rotten, not poisoned, just wrong. The way the grapes glistened too darkly. The way the bread seemed neither fresh nor stale, suspended in an unnatural in-between state. Lucia set her hands in her lap and did not touch her plate. Eleanor, ever the observer, discreetly reached into her coat pocket and retrieved a small notebook. She jotted down a quick description of the monks, their behavior, the silence. But when she looked back at them, she realized one of them was staring directly at her. The monk at the far end of the table had not moved, had not made a sound. And yet, Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze, though his face remained obscured beneath his hood. She gripped her pen tighter. The moment stretched unbearably long. Then, without shifting his posture, the monk lifted a single finger to his lips. Silence. Father Thomas, perhaps out of reflex or a desire to break the growing tension, cleared his throat and spoke. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Might we ask about your order? Your practices?" A ripple passed through the monks. Not movement, not breath, but something deeper, more imperceptible. The monk who had gestured for silence now turned his head ever so slightly toward Father Thomas. And then, with the slowest, most deliberate motion, he pressed his hands together. Not in prayer, but as if mimicking it. A hollow gesture. "They do not pray," Eleanor whispered under her breath. The words sent a shiver through the group. A monastery without prayer? A brotherhood without vows? It made no sense. And yet, as they sat there beneath the flickering candlelight, the truth settled uncomfortably in their bones. This was not a place of faith. It was something else entirely. And they had just become part of it. Would you like the next chapter to continue building the mystery? Or should something more overtly unsettling happen next? The silence stretched long after Father Thomas's words faded into the still air. It was a silence that felt deliberate, as if the walls themselves were deciding whether or not to respond. The monks remained motionless, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in that mockery of prayer. There was no conversation, no gestures of welcome, only that watchful quiet, thick as fog, pressing against the traveler's skin. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had spent her career investigating strange occurrences, peeling back layers of secrecy, but never before had silence felt like an answer in itself. She glanced at Lucia, whose fingers curled tight against her lap, at Gregory, whose sharp eyes flickered between the monks like a soldier assessing threats. Even Daniel, usually so composed, was gripping the edge of the table as though the wood were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Father Thomas cleared his throat again, though this time he did not speak. There was nothing to say. The monastery did not want their questions. It wanted them to listen. Then, without warning, one of the monks rose from his seat. The movement was so sudden and unnatural that it sent a jolt through the travelers. His head remained lowered, his hood casting deep shadows over his face. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and strode toward the far corridor. The sound of his footsteps, soft, too soft, sent an involuntary chill down Eleanor's spine. One by one, the other monks followed. No words were spoken, no signals exchanged. They simply stood and left, as if summoned by something unseen. Within moments, the dining hall was empty but for the 5 visitors and the untouched plates of food that seemed to darken in the candlelight. Gregory was the first to move. He pushed back from the table, rising with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to danger. "We need to find out what's going on," he murmured. "Sitting here won't get us answers." Lucia hesitated. And if the answers are something we don't want to find? But Eleanor was already pulling out her notebook, her journalist's instinct overriding her fear. We came here for a reason. We're not leaving without understanding why this place exists. Father Thomas hesitated only a moment before nodding. If this is truly a house of God, then there should be nothing to fear. But even as he said it, doubt flickered across his face. Together, they stepped into the dim corridors beyond the dining hall. The architecture of the monastery was unsettling in its inconsistency. Some sections were lined with Gothic arches, others with crumbling stone that seemed impossibly old. The deeper they walked, the stranger the design became, as though the monastery had not been built so much as grown, layer upon layer, century upon century, a thing that had evolved beyond its original purpose. Then they heard it, a whisper. It was faint, nearly imperceptible like wind through distant trees, but it was there, a soft, murmuring breath against the silence, curling around them like fingers in the dark. Eleanor froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Gregory nodded once, his jaw tight. Not just one voice. The sound was growing. Not louder, but closer. A slow, insidious murmur that seeped through the walls, slipping beneath doors, weaving through the very stone. It was not the whisper of the monks. It was something else, something that had been waiting for them. Would you like the next chapter to escalate the horror further, or should the tension remain slow and creeping? The whispering did not fade. It lingered in the air, curling like smoke, seeping through the monastery's ancient walls. It did not belong to the monks. It did not belong to the wind. It was something else, something that existed between the stones, between the silences. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her notebook. Every instinct in her body told her to turn back, to leave, to run, but she knew better than to let fear drive her decisions. Fear was useful. Fear was an investigator's compass, pointing toward the heart of the unknown. And this monastery was thick with the unknown. Father Thomas moved forward first, gripping the silver cross around his neck. The air was cold in the corridor, unnaturally so. With each step, the darkness pressed closer, swallowing what little candlelight flickered from the iron sconces lining the walls. "We shouldn't be here," Lucia whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the hushed murmurs, which now seemed to rise and fall like breath. "This place, it's watching us." Gregory placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, but his own expression was unreadable. "Then we'll make it watch us back." They pressed on, their footsteps unervingly muffled against the stone floor. The corridor stretched ahead in an impossible way, longer than it should have been, as though the monastery itself was shifting to keep them inside. The walls pulsed with an unseen energy, and every so often, the whispering grew sharper, more insistent, but never clear enough to understand. Then they reached the first door. It was an old wooden thing, tall and arched, reinforced with black iron hinges. The grain of the wood was deep, almost too deep, as if carved by something far older than tools. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a heavy iron latch that seemed to hum with an unnatural stillness. Daniel stepped closer, his breath shallow. "This isn't right," he muttered. "This door, it's been closed for a long time." And yet, he reached out hesitantly, fingers grazing the iron. The moment he touched it, the whispering stopped. Silence crashed around them like a wave, heavy and absolute. The monastery, for the first time since their arrival, had gone completely still. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. Something had changed. The air felt wrong, thick with anticipation. Then the latch clicked, not by Daniel's hand, not by any of them. The door opened itself. The darkness beyond it was vast and yawning, a void without depth. A breath of cold air rushed past them, carrying the scent of damp stone and something older, something rancid. The floor beneath them seemed to dip slightly, as if the monastery itself had exhaled in relief. Gregory drew a sharp breath. "We need to leave. Now." But Eleanor, despite the primal terror clawing at her mind, knew that leaving was no longer an option, because from within that darkness, something had just started moving. Would you like the next chapter to fully reveal what lies beyond the door? Or should the horror remain ambiguous and build further? The blackness beyond the door seemed more than the absence of light. It was an abyss, a depthless void that swallowed the glow of their candles without reflection. The cold it exhaled was not the chill of mere air, but something deeper, something that sank into their bones like fingers pressing through flesh. For a moment, no one moved. The monastery held its breath. The silence, thick and unnatural, wrapped around them like a burial shroud. And then, a sound. It was not a voice. It was not the whispering. It was the slow, deliberate scrape of something moving in the dark. Daniel stepped back, his breath shallow. What the hell was that? Gregory's grip tightened around the flashlight at his belt. He flicked it on, aiming its weak beam into the doorway. The light barely penetrated the blackness, revealing only stone steps descending into the earth. The walls were damp, streaked with some dark residue. The air carried the smell of something putrid, something decayed. And then, in the beam of Gregory's flashlight, something moved. It was subtle at first, like the shifting of a shadow. A shape, barely distinct, crouched low to the ground. It was humanoid in form, but wrong in its proportions. Too long in the limbs, too thin in the torso. Its head, when it lifted, was smooth and featureless, save for a gaping slit where a mouth should have been. The thing crawled forward. Not walked. Crawled. Its movements were unnatural, a jerking, insect-like motion as its limbs bent in ways they shouldn't. Its hands, if they could be called hands, scraped against the stone, leaving behind dark streaks that glistened in the light. Lucia let out a strangled gasp. Closed the door. Father Thomas fumbled forward, hands shaking as he reached for the iron latch. But before he could grasp it, the thing stopped crawling. It lifted its head, and it laughed. The sound was not human. It was layered, distorted, an echo of something that had never belonged to the world above. It was the kind of sound that did not merely pass through ears but burrowed into the skull, planting something wretched in the mind. Gregory swore under his breath, shoving Eleanor back. "Move!" The thing lunged. Father Thomas slammed the door shut just as a clawed limb lashed through the air, missing Daniel by inches. The force of the impact rattled the ancient wood, but the latch held. The whispering returned, rising in a chorus of urgent, frenzied voices. This time, the monks were not silent. Somewhere deeper in the monastery, they were chanting. It was not prayer. It was something else, something meant to keep that door closed. Would you like the next chapter to focus on the monks' reaction, or should the group attempt to flee the monastery? The door did not stop shaking. It trembled as if something on the other side was testing its strength, running clawed fingers over the wood, pressing against its hinges in slow, deliberate pulses. The iron latch, though sturdy, rattled with each movement, threatening to give way at any moment. The whispering had returned, but now it was different. It no longer slithered along the edges of their senses. It had risen, growing louder, overlapping voices spilling from the monastery walls like an unseen crowd had gathered around them. But there was something worse than the whispering. The monks were chanting. Their voices, deep and rhythmic, surged through the corridors. It was a sound that did not belong to any prayer Eleanor had ever heard. There were no words, no Latin phrases or sacred hymns. Only guttural, throaty syllables that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air itself seemed to bend under the weight of the sound. Father Thomas turned toward the source, his face pale. "That's not prayer," he murmured. "That's something else." Lucia shook her head, stepping back from the door. "I don't want to know what it is. I just want to leave." Gregory, still gripping his flashlight, flicked it toward the corridor where the chanting swelled. The beam landed on something that should have made them feel relief, but instead, it made the dread sink even deeper. The monks were standing in formation, rows of them shoulder to shoulder, lining the stone hallway. Their faces were still, their eyes fixed forward, unblinking. Their robes, heavy with age, barely moved despite the cold draft rushing through the monastery. They did not acknowledge the group. They did not acknowledge the door. They only chanted. Eleanor stepped forward cautiously. "What are they doing?" "They're holding something back," Father Thomas whispered. Then, as if in response to his words, the iron latch on the door twisted. It did not snap. It did not break. It simply shifted, bending under an invisible force as though the thing beyond the door had heard the monks and decided to answer. A ripple passed through the gathered monks, but they did not stop their chant. Their eyes did not move. And yet, Eleanor saw it. The slight twitch in their fingers, the way their robes seemed to stretch unnaturally at the seams. One monk stepped forward. His face was hollow, skin pulled taut over high cheekbones. His lips were cracked, and his eyes were a sickly yellow, like old parchment left to rot in dampness. His voice, when it rose above the others, did not match the frail body it came from. "You should not have come here," he intoned. The door behind him groaned. The iron latch twisted further, curling like wax melting in heat. Eleanor swallowed hard. "What is behind that door?" The monk did not blink. His lips barely moved as he answered. "The first mistake." Silence followed. Even the whispering seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what they would do next. And then, somewhere deep in the monastery, something else stirred. Would you like the next chapter to focus on uncovering the monk's secret, or should the group attempt to escape? The monk's words settled into the silence like a curse. The first mistake. Eleanor's breath hitched as she looked between the others, hoping for some sign of disbelief, some reassurance that they had misheard. But no one spoke. The meaning hung in the air, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Then the whispering returned. It slithered along the edges of the monastery walls, curling around them like an unseen predator sizing up its prey. It was different now, less like distant voices, more like something closer. The sound no longer drifted through the corridors. It was here, just beyond their reach, pressing against their ears like a breath on the nape of the neck. Gregory gritted his teeth. "We need to leave. Now." Lucia took a step back, her eyes darting between the unmoving monks and the trembling door. No arguments here. But the monk with the hollow face took another step forward, blocking their path. His breath was shallow, but his gaze was unwavering. The candlelight flickered against his withered skin, casting shadows that stretched too far, moving like something alive. "You must not leave," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." Daniel let out a nervous laugh. "You think we're going to stay after that thing try to get out?" He gestured toward the door, which still pulsed as if something on the other side was breathing against it. "No thanks. I'd rather freeze to death outside." The monk did not react. He merely lifted a hand and, without breaking eye contact, gestured toward the darkness beyond the hallway. And the monastery obeyed. The candles lining the walls extinguished in unison, plunging them into near-total darkness. The only light left came from Gregory's weak flashlight, its beam barely enough to illuminate the floor in front of them. But in the darkness, something else revealed itself. There was movement, not from the monks, who still stood motionless, their chant never faltering. Not from the door, which no longer shook. The movement came from above. Eleanor felt it before she saw it, the air shifting, a subtle but undeniable change in pressure, as if something massive had just descended into the space above them. Then the light caught it. Shapes. Long, jagged limbs, impossibly thin, stretching across the ceiling like the legs of a monstrous spider. They hung in stillness for only a moment before twitching to life, shifting, curling, gripping the ancient stone like hooks digging into flesh. Lucia let out a sharp gasp. "What is that?" The monk did not answer. He simply lowered his hand, and with that small gesture, the whispering became a roar. It was not a sound meant for human ears. It was something raw, something ancient, something that clawed at their minds with the weight of knowing. It carried names they had never heard before but suddenly understood. Names that did not belong to the living. The limbs above them twitched again, and then they descended. Gregory grabbed Eleanor's wrist and yanked her backward. "Run!" The monks did not move. They did not flinch as the shadowed limbs reached toward them, did not break formation as the first of the shapes slithered down from the ceiling like unraveling ribbons of black tar. Father Thomas turned, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "They're not stopping it. They're letting it happen." The monk finally blinked. "We do not stop it," he murmured. "We contain it." And then the walls of the monastery screamed. Would you like the next chapter to focus on the group's escape attempt, or should they try to understand what the monks are containing? The scream did not come from a throat, nor from anything living. It came from the very stones of the monastery itself. A deep, anguished wail that surged through the corridors like a wave of suffering long buried but never forgotten. The sound made Eleanor's bones vibrate, her teeth ache. It was not just noise, it was memory. The walls were remembering. Gregory yanked her back just as something dark lashed through the air where she had been standing. The thing that had descended from the ceiling moved like an unraveling marionette, its limbs too long, too thin, twisting at angles that should not exist. The light from the flashlight caught the gleam of something wet where its face should have been. But there were no eyes, no features, only a shifting, pulsing surface that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. "Move!" Lucia's scream shattered the paralysis that had held them in place. They bolted down the hallway, past the rows of chanting monks who remained perfectly still, their bodies rigid even as the dark thing slithered past them. The monks did not turn to look, did not acknowledge the chaos. Their chant remained steady, rhythmic, anchoring something, or perhaps someone, in place. Eleanor felt it before she saw it. As they ran, the walls shifted. Not physically. The monastery remained solid, unbroken, but the air inside it had changed. The whispering returned, but now it spoke in full sentences, in voices they knew. Eleanor. Her mother's voice drifted from the darkness, sweet and inviting. "Come back to me, my love." Lucia gasped, clutching her ears. No, he's dead. He's dead." Father Thomas faltered mid-step, his face pale. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," a child's voice whispered from the stone beside him. "You never forgave me." The monastery was calling to them. Gregory shoved Eleanor forward. "Ignore it. It's trying to break us." But the voices did not stop. They oozed from the walls, from the cracks in the stone, from the very air around them. Names, confessions, regrets, an orchestra of sorrow and guilt played in a place where the past had never died. Eleanor's breath hitched. This isn't just a monastery, she realized aloud. It's a tomb. The monks weren't keeping something in, they were trying to keep something from escaping. Lucia turned a corner too sharply, slipping on the cold stone. Gregory caught her before she fell, but his flashlight tumbled from his grasp, spinning wildly across the floor. Its beam swung up for the briefest moment, illuminating something that made all of them freeze. The walls have faces, not carved, not painted, but real, human faces stretched, twisted, half-formed, pressed into the stone like fossils of the damned. Their mouths gaped open in silent screams, their eyes hollow voids of suffering. Some were old, their features eroded into near unrecognizable expressions of pain. But others were fresh, too fresh. And then Eleanor saw one she knew, her own face. It stared back at her, mouth parted in an unfinished scream. The eyes were hollow, the skin melded into the stone, but it was her. An echo of something that had not happened yet, but was destined to. A future trapped within the monastery's memory. A hand grabbed her wrist. "Don't look," Father Thomas ordered, dragging her forward. "We have to go." But something was waiting at the end of the hallway. A door. Not the main entrance, not a chapel. Something else. It was different from the others, carved from darker wood, its surface worn smooth from centuries of hands pressing against it. The chanting of the monks seemed to grow louder the closer they got, vibrating in their skulls like a warning. "That's the heart of it," Father Thomas whispered. Gregory's fingers hesitated on the handle. "Do we go in?" Eleanor turned back, glancing down the hallway. The dark thing was still there, its limbs folding and unfolding in slow, unnatural movements, as if savoring the inevitability of its approach. Lucia swallowed hard. "Do we have a choice?" Gregory pushed open the door, and the monastery breathed in. Would you like the next chapter to focus on what they find inside the mysterious room, or should it reveal more about the monks' ritual? The door groaned open, exhaling a breath of damp, ancient air that carried the scent of decay and something metallic. something far too fresh. The moment they crossed the threshold, the monastery itself seemed to react, the flickering candlelight in the halls dimming as if the walls had drawn in a sharp breath and were now holding it. The room was circular, its walls carved from a darker, almost black stone that was different from the rest of the monastery. It was devoid of furniture, tapestries, or any sign of habitation, except for the massive relief sculpture carved into the far wall. It depicted a figure, no, a thing, looming over a sea of outstretched hands, its form shifting as though the stone itself could not decide what it was supposed to be. But that was not the most unsettling part. The walls of the room moved. Eleanor stepped forward, watching in horror as the surface of the stone subtly expanded and contracted, as though the room itself was breathing. The air thickened, humming with an energy that coiled around them like unseen fingers. Gregory's flashlight flickered, struggling against the oppressive darkness, and Lucia gripped his arm, her knuckles white. "This place is alive," Father Thomas whispered, his voice barely carried, as if the air itself was swallowing sound. The sculpture's hollow eyes stared down at them, deep enough to seem endless. And as Eleanor approached, she felt a strange pull in her chest, like something inside her was being recognized. Then the whispering returned, but this time it did not come from the walls. It came from below. Eleanor dropped to her knees, pressing her ear to the cold floor. Beneath the layers of stone, beneath the monastery itself, voices murmured, a symphony of layered, overlapping whispers that spoke in a language both foreign and instinctively understood. They were pleading. Lucia's breath hitched. "Do you hear that?" Gregory nodded slowly. "It's prayer." But it was not like any prayer they had ever heard before. It was raw, desperate, a chorus of voices all trapped in the same endless cycle of invocation. Eleanor could make out only fragments, words that came to her in waves, slipping through her mind like water through cupped hands. Bound, forgotten, the gate, sealed in flesh, the offering. The whispering grew louder, climbing the walls, rising like an unseen tide. Then, the floor beneath Eleanor's hand shifted. She jerked away as cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, releasing a sudden gust of freezing air from the depths below. The entire room shuddered, the sculpture's form twisting, its shape no longer static. The once looming figure now seemed to move, its hands reaching outward, as if waking from a long and terrible slumber. Father Thomas stepped forward, gripping the crucifix around his neck. "This is a prison." Lucia's eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, for anything that made sense. A prison for what? Gregory exhaled sharply, something that shouldn't wake up, but it was too late. The monastery had already begun to stir. The air vibrated, the unseen prayers turning into a deafening chant. The walls expanded, the breath of the monastery deepening, drawing them in. Eleanor turned back to the sculpture and realized the truth too late. It was no longer carved from stone. It was made of skin, and the eyes, those deep, bottomless voids, blinked. Panic surged through Eleanor as she stumbled backward, her heart racing wildly. The realization that the sculpture was not just stone, but living flesh sent a wave of nausea washing over her. The air, thick with the hum of energy, felt alive with a pulse that resonated in her bones. She caught sight of Gregory and Lucia, their faces mirroring her horror, disbelief freezing them in place. "Run!" Eleanor shouted, her voice breaking the oppressive atmosphere. But as she turned to escape, the very air seemed to coil around her, binding her to the spot. The walls continued to shift and breathe, the rhythmic pulsing matching the frantic beat of her heart. The whispers had morphed into a low, resonant chant, echoing off the stone, vibrating with an urgency that chilled her to the core. Father Thomas's voice rose above the clamor, a steady command. "Everyone focus. We need to stay together. If we panic, we might not make it out." His tone was laced with authority, but Eleanor could hear the underlying tremor of fear that betrayed his own resolve. Eleanor glanced at the figure once more, and the horror only deepened. The skin was mottled, stretching taut over a frame that seemed to shift and breathe. What had once been a grotesque sculpture now had veins, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested life, or perhaps something more sinister. The eyes blinked slowly, as if waking from an ancient slumber, a dark awareness unfurling in the depths of those voids. The whispers intensified, blending into a cacophony of voices, and Eleanor struggled to make sense of them. They spoke of sacrifice, of offerings made long ago, and of a dark promise that had tethered them to this very spot. It was a binding, a contract forged in blood and desperation that had entrapped both the living and the dead within these walls. "What is it?" Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. "What do they want?" I think they want us," Gregory stammered, his eyes darting around the room. "To feed something." The room felt as though it was closing in, the very stones vibrating with a hunger that was palpable. Eleanor's thoughts raced, piecing together the fragmented whispers that seemed to hang in the air. "The offering, the gate," she murmured, realizing with a growing dread that they were not just intruders. They were candidates, part of a gruesome ritual that had been planned long before their arrival. As she spoke, the pulsing intensified, and suddenly, the figure on the wall began to pull away from the stone, its limbs stretching outward with a grace that belied its grotesque form. It reached out, its elongated fingers curling as if to beckon them closer. For a moment, Eleanor felt an inexplicable compulsion, a draw toward the figure that defied all rational thought. "No, we can't," Father Thomas shouted, grounding them in reality. "We need to break the cycle." He reached into his pocket and produced a small vial of holy water, the glass glinting ominously in the dim light. "We have to drive it back." Eleanor watched as he raised the vial, a protective gesture against the growing entity. But the air thickened, charged with a force that felt like a storm gathering. The whispers morphed into screams, echoing her fears and doubt. The walls trembled in response, and for a brief moment, Eleanor felt as if the entire monastery was alive, aware of their presence and their intent. Before she could process her next move, a hand shot out from the figure, grasping the air with a desperation that transcended human emotion. The fingers elongated, thin and sinewy, reaching for the very essence of their being. "Come back," it hissed, and Eleanor felt the pull again, stronger this time, wrapping around her heart like a vice. "No." She tore her gaze away, turning to the others. "We have to leave. Now." Gregory and Lucia were already moving, and with a burst of adrenaline, Eleanor joined them, racing toward the door. But as they reached for the handle, the room convulsed, the walls bending inward as though the very structure of the monastery wanted to keep them inside, to cocoon them in darkness. Just as they stumbled through the doorway, a deafening roar echoed from behind them, a sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. The ground shook, and the air ignited with a feral energy. "What have we done?" Eleanor cried as they barreled down the hallway, the walls vibrating with wrath, a fury born of years of unfulfilled hunger. They could not look back. The sound of the awakening entity lingered behind them, a promise that this was only the beginning. Would you like to continue with the next chapter, focusing on their escape and any revelations about the monastery's history? Eleanor, Gregory, and Lucia raced through the dimly lit corridors of the monastery, their hearts pounding in their chests as the echoes of their footfalls merged with the thunderous roars that reverberated behind them. The air grew heavy with an oppressive dread, a palpable tension that clung to their skin and threatened to suffocate them. As they fled, the once familiar architecture of the monastery twisted into a nightmarish landscape. Walls seemed to shift, and shadows danced in the flickering light, morphing into grotesque shapes that taunted their panic. "We need to find a way out," Lucia gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She glanced over her shoulder, fear etched on her face. "What if it comes after us?" "Just keep running," Eleanor urged, focusing on the path ahead, her mind racing to find an escape. They darted past ancient doors, their surfaces carved with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Each step felt like an intrusion into a realm that had long been sealed, a world that had awaited their arrival with open arms. As they rounded a corner, they stumbled into a small chapel, its air thick with the scent of damp wood and burning wax. The flickering candles cast eerie shadows on the walls, revealing a stained glass window that depicted a scene of suffering and redemption. The grotesque figure from the breathing room loomed large in one of the panels, its mouth twisted in a silent scream, an ominous reminder of the horrors they had unleashed. Father Thomas, still clutching the vial of holy water, stepped forward. "We can't just hide here. We need to understand what's happening." He moved to the altar, dusting off an ancient tome that lay abandoned, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. This might hold the key to stopping it. Eleanor and Gregory exchanged anxious glances as they gathered around the altar. "What if it doesn't work?" Gregory asked. The fear in his eyes mirrored in Eleanor's heart. The weight of their situation bore down upon them, a stark reminder of the risks they faced. Father Thomas flipped through the pages, scanning the faded text with growing urgency. It speaks of a curse, an ancient pact made by the founders of this monastery. They sought power, but it came at a terrible price, a sacrifice to keep an insatiable entity bound. His voice trembled as he read. "If they do not continue to feed it, it awakens, and those who disturb it become part of its offering." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "So, we're not just running for our lives, we're part of this cycle." The revelation settled heavily in the room. The whispers of the trapped souls, the ominous sculpture, everything suddenly made sense, and yet it felt utterly horrifying. Gregory leaned closer, peering over Father Thomas's shoulder. "Is there a way to reverse it? A way to break the cycle?" "There may be a ritual," Father Thomas replied, his brow furrowed with concentration. "It speaks of a gathering of light, a way to confront the entity and send it back to its prison. But we need to gather specific items, elements that symbolize purity and hope." As he continued to read, Eleanor felt a stirring of hope amidst the chaos. "What do we need? Salt, fire, and something sacred, perhaps a relic or an object infused with deep significance," Father Thomas said, the fervor in his voice rising. "If we can gather these items, we might have a chance." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook again, and the shadows seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The air thickened, filled with a rancid scent that made Eleanor gag. They needed to act fast. Time was running out. "Let's split up," Lucia suggested, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We'll cover more ground that way. We can meet back here in 10 minutes. Eleanor's instincts screamed against the idea, but she knew that they had little choice. "Okay, but be careful. We don't know what else might be lurking in these halls." As they divided, Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, the darkness closing in around her. She pressed forward, her heart racing as she entered a narrow passageway adorned with more symbols, each more twisted than the last. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. Shadows flickered at the corners of her vision, whispering secrets that sent shivers through her. Her thoughts turned to the entity, the horrific figure that had stirred from its slumber. What if they couldn't find the items in time? What if it was too late? As panic threatened to engulf her, she stumbled into a small alcove, its light dim but warm. Inside, she found a battered wooden chest, its surface marked with ancient carvings. A sense of urgency washed over her as she pried it open, revealing a small collection of items: a vial of salt, a flickering candle, and a tarnished silver cross. She clutched the cross tightly, feeling its cool metal against her palm, a flicker of hope igniting within her. As she turned to leave, a cold breeze rushed past her, chilling her to the bone. The whispers returned, louder than ever, clawing at her mind. "Come back, join us." Eleanor shook her head, forcing herself to focus on her mission. She had to return to the chapel and regroup with Gregory and Father Thomas. She could feel the weight of the shadows pressing in around her, a reminder that they were never truly alone in the monastery. With newfound determination, she pushed forward, ready to confront whatever darkness lay ahead. The monastery was alive with secrets, and she was determined to unravel them before it consumed her and her friends entirely. The air in the monastery felt heavy as Eleanor, clutching the silver cross, made her way back to the chapel. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and chaotic, echoing in the silence that enveloped her. The shadows seemed to whisper secrets as they twisted and turned, drawing her deeper into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, and that each moment spent in the monastery brought them closer to the brink of despair. Upon entering the chapel, Eleanor found Gregory and Father Thomas engaged in hushed conversation, their expressions strained. Lucia was still missing, and Eleanor's heart dropped at the thought. "I found some things," she exclaimed, rushing towards them. "I have salt, a candle, and this cross." She held up the tarnished silver cross, the cool metal gleaming in the dim light. Father Thomas's eyes widened with hope as he examined the cross. "This is perfect. The silver symbolizes purity, and it will help to amplify the light we need for the ritual. But we still need fire, and we must gather the others." "What about Lucia?" Gregory asked, his voice laced with worry. "She should have been back by now." Eleanor's stomach twisted with anxiety. "We need to find her," she urged, scanning the chapel for any sign of their friend. "She might have found something crucial." Father Thomas nodded, his expression grave. "We'll split up again. Gregory and I will search the upper levels. Eleanor, you check the lower levels. Go to the cellar. It's the last place I saw Lucia." Eleanor swallowed hard, nodding in agreement despite the gnawing fear in her gut. The cellar was notorious for its dark corners and lurking shadows, but she couldn't let her fear paralyze her. She had to be brave for Lucia's sake. Descending the stone steps into the cellar, Eleanor felt an oppressive darkness envelop her. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Flickering shadows danced along the walls as she hesitated, her instincts screaming for her to turn back. But she couldn't abandon her friend. She wouldn't forgive herself if something happened to Lucia. The cellar was a maze of forgotten relics, ancient barrels, and dusty crates, each whispering stories of a time long past. Eleanor's heart raced as she called out for Lucia, her voice trembling with trepidation. "Lucia, are you down here?" Silence answered, amplifying her growing anxiety. As she ventured deeper into the shadows, Eleanor stumbled upon a small door set into the stone wall. It was ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Hope surged through her as she approached, her heart racing. "Lucia," she called again, her voice now stronger. "Are you in there?" Pushing the door open, Eleanor found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The flickering light came from a single candle that stood on a makeshift altar adorned with strange symbols. And there, kneeling before the altar, was Lucia, her hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. "Lucia!" Eleanor exclaimed, relief flooding her as she rushed forward. But as she reached her friend, she felt a chill in the air, and the shadows seemed to close in tighter around them. "What are you doing?" Lucia turned, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "I found this room, Eleanor. There's something here, a relic, something powerful. I think it could help us." Eleanor felt a spark of excitement, but it quickly dissipated as she noticed the shadows dancing more aggressively. "We need to leave. The entity is awakening. We don't have much time." Lucia nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the altar. "Just a moment, Eleanor. I feel a connection to this place. I need to understand what it wants." Before Eleanor could protest, a sudden tremor shook the ground, and the shadows surged forward, coiling around them like living tendrils. The candle flickered violently, illuminating the room in brief flashes that revealed terrifying shapes looming in the darkness. Panic gripped Eleanor as she grabbed Lucia's arm. "We have to go now." As they turned to leave, a piercing scream echoed through the cellar, freezing them in their tracks. It was a sound of pure anguish, a cry that resonated deep within Eleanor's bones. "Help me!" The voice called, a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate off the very walls. Eleanor's heart sank as she recognized the voice. It was Father Thomas. "He's in trouble," she gasped, her instincts screaming at her to help him. "Wait, Eleanor. We can't just—" Lucia began, but the shadows thickened, swirling around them and pressing closer. The room felt alive with darkness, and the air crackled with malevolence. Driven by fear and desperation, Eleanor pushed through the door, dragging Lucia with her. They raced up the stairs, the echoes of Father Thomas's cries pushing them forward. Every instinct in Eleanor's body urged her to save him, despite the paralyzing dread that gripped her. As they burst into the chapel, the scene before them was chaotic. Shadows writhed and twisted in the air, their forms indistinct yet threatening. Gregory stood by the altar, clutching a candle, his face a mask of terror. Father Thomas lay on the ground, his hands gripping his throat, his face contorted in pain. Eleanor and Lucia rushed to Father Thomas's side. "What happened?" Eleanor cried, kneeling beside him. "What can we do?" "The entity," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "It's trying to break free. Feed it, or we'll all be lost." Eleanor's heart raced as the shadows deepened, swirling ominously around them. The air grew colder, and the flickering candlelight seemed to dim. They had to gather their strength, harness the light, and confront the darkness that threatened to consume them all. It was time to face the horror that awaited, to gather their resolve, and push back against the shadows of the past. The chaos in the chapel intensified as the shadows writhed with newfound energy, fueled by the fear that hung thick in the air. Eleanor, her heart pounding, felt the weight of the moment press down on her. Father Thomas lay gasping on the floor, and Gregory stood frozen with a flickering candle in his hand. They were out of time. The darkness was closing in, and they needed a plan, a way to push back against the encroaching terror. "Gather around," Eleanor shouted, her voice breaking through the fear. "We need to create a circle of light. It's the only way to fight this." The others looked to her, confusion and desperation in their eyes, but Eleanor's determination sparked something within them. They had come too far to let the shadows claim them now. Lucia knelt beside Father Thomas, clutching the silver cross that Eleanor had found. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling but resolute. "How do we make this work?" Father Thomas struggled to sit up, his face pale and strained. "We must channel our energy, our faith, into the candle. The light must be strong enough to counter the darkness. If we can focus together, we can create a barrier." Eleanor nodded, feeling a surge of hope. "Let's do it. Everyone, hold hands and focus on the light." They formed a tight circle around the candle, the flickering flame illuminating their faces with a warm glow that felt comforting against the encroaching shadows. As they joined hands, Eleanor closed her eyes and focused on the light. Memories flooded her mind, her childhood, the laughter of friends, the warmth of love. She envisioned that light growing within her, a beacon of hope and resilience. She could feel the energy radiating among them, weaving their individual strengths into a collective force. "Now," Father Thomas urged, his voice a hoarse whisper, "channel everything you have into the candle. Let it illuminate the truth within you." With a deep breath, Eleanor concentrated all her thoughts on the candle, envisioning it bursting into a brilliant flame. The shadows, sensing their defiance, thrashed violently, but Eleanor could feel the circle of light beginning to push them back. A golden aura enveloped them, pulsating with each heartbeat, growing stronger and brighter as they poured their strength into it. The candle flickered wildly, and for a moment, Eleanor feared it might extinguish, but then, with a rush of energy, it blazed into a radiant column of light. The shadows recoiled as the light pierced through the darkness, illuminating every corner of the chapel. Faces that had once been twisted in fear now shone with determination. Eleanor opened her eyes to see the shadows beginning to dissipate. The dark tendrils curled away from the candle's flame, hissing like agitated serpents. "We're doing it! Keep going!" she urged, her voice rising above the cacophony of chaos. But just as victory seemed within reach, The ground beneath them trembled violently. A deep, resonating growl echoed through the chapel, shaking the very foundations of the monastery. The shadows, now enraged, swirled violently around them, clawing at the edges of their light. "Don't let it break us," Gregory shouted, his voice strained as he squeezed Eleanor's hand. "We have to stand firm." Eleanor focused on their joined hands, the warmth of their connection grounding her amidst the chaos. "Think of the love and strength we share," she called out. "Remember why we're here." The memories of laughter, friendship, and their shared mission surged through her, reinforcing the barrier they were building together. As they concentrated, Eleanor caught a glimpse of something strange, a figure cloaked in shadows, watching them from the edge of the light. It was the same haunting presence that had plagued her since they arrived at the monastery. But now, it seemed to flicker and waver, uncertain against the powerful light they had created. The presence lunged forward, its shape shifting and morphing, but Eleanor felt an unwavering resolve building within her. "We can't let it in," she shouted. "This is our sanctuary." With that declaration, she pushed all her energy into the candle, willing it to shine brighter, to protect them from the darkness that threatened to overwhelm them. Suddenly, the candle erupted in a blinding light, filling the entire chapel with a radiant glow that washed over them. The shadows shrieked, twisting in agony as the light enveloped them, banishing the darkness that had plagued the monastery for so long. The air crackled with energy, and for a fleeting moment, time stood still. As the light faded, Eleanor opened her eyes, gasping as the shadows retreated completely. The chapel was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a fog. They had done it. They had pushed back the darkness, at least for now. Father Thomas, still weak, smiled at them with gratitude. But as they stood there, breathing in the newfound calm, Eleanor felt a chill sweep through the room. A faint whisper echoed in the distance, a reminder that the darkness was not truly vanquished. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. There was still much to uncover about the malevolent force that haunted the monastery, and the bond they had forged in the face of terror would be their greatest weapon. With determination renewed, Eleanor turned to her friends. "We need to regroup and figure out our next move. Whatever is happening here, we must confront it head-on." They nodded, the strength of their unity palpable in the air, ready to face the darkness lurking just beyond the light. The air in the chapel was thick with a mix of triumph and tension as Eleanor and her companions collected themselves after the confrontation with the shadows. The flickering candle had dimmed, but the warmth of their collective energy lingered, illuminating their path forward. Father Thomas leaned heavily against the cold stone wall, regaining his breath, while Gregory and Lucia exchanged wary glances, their earlier confidence now shadowed by uncertainty. Eleanor felt a weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. They had pushed back the darkness, but questions lingered like the echoes of their past. What had awakened the malevolent force? What secrets lay buried within the monastery's ancient walls? She realized that their victory was only a prelude to a deeper mystery that needed unraveling. "Father, we need to know what we're up against," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "You've been here longer than any of us. What do you know about this place?" She felt a stirring of urgency. The time for passive observation had passed. Father Thomas nodded slowly, his expression somber. "The monastery has a long and dark history. It was built centuries ago, a sanctuary for those seeking solace. But over the years, it has been a site of tragedy and loss, filled with stories of unexplainable occurrences and untimely deaths. Many believe that the land itself is cursed." He paused, his gaze drifting to the heavy stone walls. "There are rumors of a hidden chamber beneath the monastery, where dark rituals were once performed." Eleanor's heart raced at the mention of a hidden chamber. The idea of uncovering something so significant sent shivers down her spine. A hidden chamber? We need to find it. It could hold the answers we seek. Lucia, her curiosity piqued, chimed in. "But how do we even begin to look for something like that?" This place is massive. She cast a wary glance around the chapel, the once familiar space, now feeling alien and foreboding. We could start by searching the library, Gregory suggested. If there's any record of the monastery's history, it will be there. There must be something that points to the hidden chamber. Nodding in agreement, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. Let's move quickly. We don't know how long the darkness will remain at bay. They gathered their resolve, each step forward fueled by the urgency to uncover the truth and protect themselves from whatever darkness lay in wait. As they made their way through the winding corridors of the monastery, Eleanor could feel the walls whispering secrets long forgotten. The dim light from their lanterns cast eerie shadows, stretching and distorting as if trying to conceal the truth. The air grew cooler, and a palpable tension hung around them, as if the very structure of the monastery was aware of their quest. Entering the library, the scent of old parchment and dust enveloped them. The room was lined with towering shelves filled with books, their spines worn and faded. Eleanor felt a thrill run through her as she scanned the titles. Tomes of theology, histories, and accounts of the supernatural. Let's split up and search for anything related to the hidden chamber or rituals, she instructed. As Eleanor sifted through the volumes, she felt a strange connection to the texts, as though they were alive with stories begging to be told. One particular book caught her eye, a leather-bound volume adorned with strange symbols. She pulled it from the shelf, dust motes dancing in the dim light as she opened its pages. Inside, she found references to the monastery's founding, interwoven with mentions of a dark force that had plagued the area for centuries. A passage caught her attention, detailing a ritual that could either bind the darkness or unleash it further. "Guys, come look at this," she called, her voice echoing in the hushed library. Gregory and Lucia hurried over, peering over her shoulder as she read aloud. The ritual requires a gathering of souls bound by purpose, a united front against the shadows. Failure to perform it correctly can result in a catastrophic awakening of the dark entity. A chill swept through Eleanor as she realized the weight of their situation. They weren't just fighting against the darkness. They were part of a much larger story, one that could determine the fate of the monastery and perhaps even a world beyond its walls. Father Thomas joined them, leaning heavily against a nearby table. "This is significant. We must find the hidden chamber before it's too late. If the ritual is still possible, we may have a chance to seal the darkness for good." Feeling the urgency rising, Eleanor scanned the pages for more clues. There must be some indication of where the chamber is located. It has to be connected to the layout of the monastery. She flipped through the book, her heart pounding as she desperately sought the information that could lead them to the answers they needed. Finally, in the margins of one page, she found a crude map of the monastery. It depicted a hidden passageway beneath the chapel that led to a lower level. "Here!" Eleanor exclaimed, excitement and dread intertwining. "This map shows a path from the chapel. We need to follow it." With the newfound knowledge in hand, they set out to uncover the secrets that lay beneath the stone of the monastery. Each step was fraught with anticipation, the air charged with the potential of what they might find. Eleanor felt a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. They were on the cusp of unraveling a dark history, one that could either save them or lead them deeper into the shadows. As they prepared to descend into the depths of the monastery, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows, once retreating, seemed to stir with a life of their own, whispering warnings that echoed through her mind. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. They had to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The atmosphere in the monastery grew increasingly oppressive as Eleanor and her companions prepared to descend into the hidden passage. The dim flicker of their lanterns barely illuminated the chapel's stone walls, which seemed to close in around them, as if the very structure of the monastery was aware of their intentions. With the crude map clutched tightly in her hands, Eleanor felt a sense of determination surge within her. They were not merely seeking answers. They were diving headfirst into a mystery that had long haunted this ancient place. As they moved cautiously toward the chapel's altar, Eleanor could hear the muted whispers of her companions behind her. Gregory and Lucia exchanged anxious glances, while Father Thomas murmured a quiet prayer, as if seeking divine protection before they ventured into the unknown. The air was thick with anticipation and trepidation, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows lurking in the corners of the chapel were eager to swallow them whole. Following the map, they found a small, almost imperceptible door behind the altar. Its heavy wood was weathered, adorned with intricate carvings that depicted figures locked in eternal struggle against a looming darkness. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, her heart racing as she pushed the door open. A musty odor wafted toward them, mixed with a chill that penetrated deep into her bones. They were standing at the entrance of the hidden passageway, the air inside thick with secrets long buried. With a deep breath, Eleanor led the way, stepping into the narrow tunnel that extended downward into darkness. The stones beneath their feet were damp and uneven, and the sound of dripping water echoed ominously around them. Each step felt heavy, as if they were descending into the very depths of despair. The light from their lanterns flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to twist and contort with each movement. As they ventured deeper, the passageway narrowed, forcing them to walk in single file. Eleanor felt the weight of silence pressing against them, interrupted only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional whisper of the wind outside. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of their earlier confrontation with the shadows, and she couldn't help but wonder what awaited them in the depths below. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, the size of which took Eleanor's breath away. The walls were adorned with ancient symbols, glowing faintly in the light of their lanterns. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like the teeth of some great beast, and a pool of dark water glimmered ominously at the chamber's center. The atmosphere was charged with energy, a palpable sense of foreboding that gripped their hearts. "Do you feel that?" Lucia whispered, her voice barely audible as she stepped cautiously into the chamber. "It's like the air is alive." The others nodded, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. This place was unlike anything they had ever encountered, a nexus of power that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Eleanor moved closer to the pool of water, drawn by an inexplicable force. The surface was still, reflecting the flickering light of their lanterns, but something beneath stirred, a dark presence that writhed just out of sight. She knelt at the edge, peering into the depths, her heart racing as shadows swirled just below the surface. "What do you think is down there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Father Thomas approached, his expression grave. "This water could be a conduit to the dark forces that haunt this monastery. We must tread carefully. If the legends are true, this chamber is where the rituals were performed, where the darkness was once unleashed." His eyes scanned the walls, searching for any clues or signs that could help them understand the purpose of this place. As they examined the chamber, Eleanor noticed markings on the floor surrounding the pool, symbols that resembled those etched into the altar above. "These are the same symbols," she said, tracing her fingers over the cold stone. "They must have significance in the rituals. Perhaps we need to recreate something to understand what we're dealing with." But just as she spoke, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. A low rumble reverberated through the chamber, causing dust to fall from the ceiling. The water in the pool began to churn violently, and Eleanor felt a surge of energy radiating from it, as if the darkness within was awakening. "Get back!" Gregory shouted, instinctively pulling Lucia away from the edge. They stumbled backward as the surface of the water erupted, sending dark tendrils spiraling upward, reaching for them like grasping hands. The chamber shook, and Eleanor felt a wave of panic wash over her. This was not just a hidden chamber. It was a prison for something far more sinister. The shadows that had once been confined to the corners of the monastery now surged forth, coalescing into a swirling mass of darkness. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized they were not alone in this chamber. They had awakened the malevolent force that had been lying in wait. The time for answers had come, but at what cost? As the darkness swirled around them, Eleanor felt a deep sense of determination rise within her. They had come too far to turn back now. We need to perform the ritual. It's the only way to contain whatever this is, she shouted, her voice resolute amidst the chaos. With her companions rallying around her, they quickly began to draw the symbols they had seen on the ground, desperate to anchor themselves against the encroaching darkness. The fate of the monastery, and perhaps their very lives, hung in the balance as they prepared to confront the darkness that had been unleashed from its ancient prison. As the darkness writhed around them, Eleanor and her companions felt the weight of their decision bearing down upon them. The swirling shadows pressed in closer, their movements frantic and menacing, as if sensing the intention to counter their malevolent presence. The air crackled with tension, a stark reminder that time was slipping away. Eleanor could hardly catch her breath as she gathered her thoughts, urging herself to remain calm in the face of chaos. The ancient symbols they had begun to draw on the ground felt like a lifeline, a way to harness the power of the monastery's forgotten past against the encroaching evil. Father Thomas took the lead, his voice steady despite the circumstances. We need to focus. Each of these symbols holds a purpose. They are not just markings. They represent the balance between light and darkness. If we can align our intentions with the energy in this chamber, we might just have a chance. With renewed determination, the group quickly began to replicate the intricate designs they had found in the markings, their fingers trembling but resolute. Eleanor could feel the darkness pressing down, but she refused to be intimidated. As she traced her fingers over the symbols, she channeled her energy into the lines, whispering incantations she could barely recall from the old texts they had discovered earlier. Lucia and Gregory followed suit, their voices blending into a chant that echoed throughout the chamber. The sound seemed to resonate with the very stone beneath them, vibrating in harmony with the energy that surged around the pool of dark water. Suddenly, the dark tendrils that had been swirling around them paused, as if sensing the power of their ritual. The atmosphere shifted, and for a brief moment, a sense of clarity washed over Eleanor. She could see flashes of the past, images of the monks who had once inhabited the monastery, their faces etched with fear and desperation as they sought to contain the very darkness they had unwittingly unleashed. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. This was not just a confrontation. It was a reckoning with the past. As they continued their chanting, the darkness responded. A low growl emanated from the pool, reverberating through the chamber and causing the stone walls to tremble. Eleanor felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the moment they had been preparing for. But she knew they had to act quickly. If they faltered, the darkness would reclaim its dominion. With each symbol they completed, the energy in the room intensified. The glow from their lanterns began to merge with the faint light of the markings on the floor, creating a luminous pathway that pulsed like a heartbeat. Eleanor could feel the connection between them, the way their voices interwove, creating a tapestry of resistance against the malevolent force. It was as if they were part of something greater, a collective effort to push back the tide of darkness that threatened to consume them. Just as they reached the final symbol, a tremendous roar erupted from the depths of the pool. The water surged upwards, forming a monstrous visage that took shape amidst the shadows. Eleanor's heart raced as she looked into the face of pure malevolence, a reflection of all the suffering that had been unleashed upon the world. The eyes glowed with an unholy light, piercing through the dimness of the chamber and locking onto hers. "Foolish mortals!" the dark figure boomed, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through the chamber. "You think you can contain me? I have thrived in the shadows for centuries. Your efforts are futile." The figure's presence was suffocating, the air thick with despair, but Eleanor felt an inner strength rising within her. She refused to be intimidated. "No!" Eleanor shouted, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "We are not here to banish you. We are here to confront you, to understand the truth that lies beneath your terror. You may have caused suffering, but you will not dictate our fate." Her words seemed to ignite a flicker of hope, as if the light within her was breaking through the suffocating darkness. The other members of the group rallied around her, their voices rising in a collective chorus. They chanted with renewed vigor, each word resonating with the symbols they had drawn on the ground. The energy in the chamber surged, the darkness recoiling momentarily, as if pushed back by their defiance. The water of the pool began to churn violently, and Eleanor could feel the very foundations of the monastery trembling in response to their unified stand. As the darkness writhed, it began to shift, revealing glimpses of its past, a history of betrayal, anguish, and loss. Eleanor could see the faces of the monks who had once gathered here, their own desperation having given birth to the very evil they sought to contain. Understanding flooded over her. This darkness was not simply a malevolent force. It was a manifestation of pain that had long been ignored. With this realization, Eleanor felt a profound sense of empathy. "We can end this cycle of suffering," she declared, her voice steady. "We can find peace, not through banishment, but through understanding. You are not our enemy. You are a reflection of our fears. Let us help you find closure." The darkness paused, its monstrous form faltering as Eleanor's words echoed through the chamber. The air thickened with tension, a palpable silence settling over them as the shadows hesitated. Eleanor could feel the weight of their collective hope, a glimmering beacon amidst the encroaching gloom. Perhaps they could forge a new path, one that embraced healing rather than fear. As the darkness began to retreat, the chamber filled with light, illuminating the symbols they had drawn. The monstrous figure that had threatened them faded, replaced by a serene presence that whispered through the air. "Help me find my peace," it murmured, its voice softer now, a desperate plea for release. In that moment, Eleanor understood that the true battle was not against an external force, but within themselves. They had the power to change the narrative, to transform fear into understanding and suffering into healing. With renewed determination, they embraced the challenge ahead, ready to confront the darkness within the monastery and within themselves. The ritual had become a bridge, connecting them to a past that was desperate for resolution, a chance to finally end the cycle of pain that had haunted the monastery for centuries. With the monstrous visage receding into the ether, a profound silence enveloped the chamber, thick with anticipation and the promise of change. Eleanor and her companions stood amidst the ancient symbols, their hearts pounding in unison. The atmosphere had shifted. The once oppressive darkness now felt lighter, as if the weight of centuries of suffering had begun to lift. It was a moment of both trepidation and hope, a fragile balance that needed nurturing to sustain the newfound clarity they had glimpsed. Father Thomas, breathing heavily, broke the silence. "We've reached a pivotal point," he said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. "The darkness is not gone, but we've discovered its roots. It thrives on fear and pain, and we must confront these emotions if we are to truly free this place." The realization of their task ahead began to settle in, revealing the complexity of their journey. They were not merely seeking to exorcise a malevolent spirit. They were embarking on a path of healing for both the monastery and themselves. Eleanor glanced around at her companions, Lucia, Gregory, and Father Thomas, each face reflecting a mixture of determination and fear. "What do we do next?" she asked, the weight of leadership resting heavily on her shoulders. They needed a plan, a way to channel the energy of the chamber into something constructive, something that could truly change the narrative. Lucia stepped forward, her expression resolute. "We must connect with the souls trapped within this darkness. We've already shown that we can confront it, but we need to dive deeper. If we can reach out to the monks who suffered here, we might find the key to their release." The suggestion hung in the air, imbued with both promise and risk. They would need to access the depths of their own fears and sorrows to facilitate this connection. The group formed a circle, joining hands in solidarity. Eleanor felt the warmth of their touch, a shared commitment to face the darkness together. They began to chant softly, a blend of words and intentions that echoed through the chamber, weaving a tapestry of connection that transcended time and space. The symbols they had drawn glowed faintly, responding to their collective energy, and the chamber pulsated with the rhythm of their voices. As they focused their thoughts, Eleanor envisioned the monks who had once inhabited the monastery. She could see their faces, worn and weary, etched with a longing for peace. In that moment, she understood that they, too, were trapped in a cycle of suffering, unable to move on from the pain of their past. Eleanor felt a deep empathy for them. Their struggle mirrored her own, their fears reflected in her heart. Suddenly, the air shimmered, and the shadows coalesced around them, forming figures that resembled the monks. Each figure bore the weight of sorrow, their expressions filled with both longing and confusion. Eleanor's heart raced, a mixture of fear and compassion coursing through her. She knew they were not here to judge, but to guide. The monks needed to confront their own demons before they could be freed. With renewed purpose, Eleanor spoke, her voice strong and steady. "You are not alone. We're here to help you find peace. We understand your pain, and we honor your journey." The monks' forms flickered, and for a brief moment, Eleanor could see the flicker of recognition in their eyes. She felt an ancient connection binding them, a thread of shared experience that transcended the boundaries of time. The chamber responded to her words, the energy shifting as the monks began to gather closer. Father Thomas led them in a prayer, invoking the spirit of forgiveness and healing. Lucia and Gregory added their voices, creating a harmonious chant that reverberated through the stone walls, filling the chamber with light. Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing the energy to envelop her, feeling the weight of their collective sorrow as it mingled with her own. In that moment, the darkness within the monks began to wane, replaced by a flickering light. Their forms solidified, revealing the depths of their suffering, their regrets, their fears, and their longings for redemption. Eleanor felt the emotional toll that had bound them to this place. It was a reminder of the unresolved pain they had carried for too long. With each chant, she felt their anguish, an echo of her own struggles surfacing from the depths of her memory. "Let go of your pain," Eleanor urged, her voice a steady beacon amidst the swirling emotions. "Embrace the light that lies beyond this darkness. You are not defined by your suffering. We can help you find your way home." The monks' expressions shifted, their eyes brightening as if recognizing the truth in her words. Slowly, one by one, they began to nod, a flicker of hope igniting within them. As the last of their sorrow began to dissipate, a warm light filled the chamber, illuminating the ancient symbols on the ground. The monks' forms grew translucent, their burdens lifting as they stepped into the light. Eleanor felt a surge of energy coursing through her, a powerful affirmation of their connection and the healing they had facilitated. She watched in awe as the monks began to fade, their faces now serene, embodying the peace they had long sought. The chamber shone brightly, the darkness retreating into the corners, no longer holding sway over their lives. Eleanor felt a sense of relief wash over her. They had accomplished what they had set out to do, but as the light enveloped them, she also felt an unfamiliar twinge of loss. The monks were no longer trapped, yet she mourned the end of a chapter, the closing of a door that had once been filled with suffering. As the last echoes of the monks' presence faded into the ether, Eleanor and her companions stood in silence, the enormity of what they had achieved settling in. They had not only confronted the darkness of the monastery, but had also faced their own fears and emerged stronger for it. Yet, the journey was far from over. They had glimpsed the power of unity and compassion, but they now had to confront the darkness that lingered beyond this chamber, the shadow that still haunted the edges of the monastery. "What comes next?" Lucia asked, her voice breaking the silence, a mix of hope and apprehension evident in her tone. Eleanor knew the answer lay ahead, beyond the physical confines of the monastery, a path that required them to continue embracing the light they had ignited within themselves. Together, They would forge a new narrative, one of healing, understanding, and resilience in the face of darkness. In the aftermath of their powerful experience within the chamber, Eleanor and her companions found themselves at a crossroads, faced with the daunting task of confronting the remnants of the darkness that still lingered in the monastery. While they had successfully freed the souls of the monks, they understood that the malevolent force that had ensnared them was far from defeated. The air around them buzzed with an unsettling energy, a reminder that the battle against the shadows was not yet over. As they emerged from the chamber, the group felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The once oppressive weight had lessened, but an eerie silence now enveloped the corridors of the monastery, echoing the uncertainty that hung in the air. The flickering candles cast long shadows, their dim light barely penetrating the depths of the ancient stone walls. Each step they took felt heavy, laden with the memories of what had transpired and the knowledge that they were not yet free from the clutches of darkness. Father Thomas, sensing the group's apprehension, took a deep breath and spoke with quiet authority. "We must explore the monastery further. There may be hidden chambers, forgotten relics, or even remnants of the darkness we need to confront. Our journey is not complete until we understand the full scope of what we are dealing with." His words resonated with Eleanor, igniting a spark of determination within her. They had come too far to turn back now. They needed to face whatever awaited them in the shadows. The group decided to split up, each taking a different wing of the monastery to investigate. Eleanor chose the eastern corridor, where the air felt heavier, almost stagnant, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. As she walked, she could feel the echoes of the past reverberating off the stone walls, each footstep a reminder of the countless souls who had walked these halls before her. She paused before a series of ornate wooden doors, intricately carved with images of celestial beings. They felt strangely inviting, yet there was an undercurrent of foreboding that tugged at her intuition. Gathering her courage, she pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit chapel adorned with dusty pews and a weathered altar. The air was thick with the scent of incense, mingling with the dust of ages, creating an atmosphere steeped in reverence and sorrow. As Eleanor stepped inside, a chill ran down her spine. The chapel felt alive, the shadows shifting and dancing as if holding conversations in hushed tones. Her heart raced as she approached the altar, drawn by an unseen force. On it lay an ancient tome, its pages yellowed and fragile. The cover bore the same intricate symbols they had drawn in the chamber, and Eleanor felt an inexplicable connection to it. She reached out to touch the book, her fingers grazing the cover, and a surge of energy pulsed through her. Visions flashed before her eyes, images of monks in prayer, their faces twisted in anguish, shadows creeping around them, binding them to their grief. The book held their stories, their fears, and the very essence of the darkness that had consumed them. With each heartbeat, she felt the weight of their pain and the urgency of her mission to uncover the truth. Eleanor carefully opened the tome, revealing its contents, an account of the monastery's history, intertwined with dark rituals and tragic events. She read about the founding monks who had sought to create a sanctuary, but had inadvertently summoned a malevolent entity through their desperation for power and control. The echoes of their past actions reverberated through the pages, revealing the cycle of suffering that had ensnared them. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. Spinning around, she came face to face with Gregory, his expression pale and anxious. "Eleanor, we need to regroup. I found something in the West Wing that you need to see." His urgency snapped her out of the trance the book had cast upon her. She nodded, clutching the tome tightly as they made their way back to the main hall, the weight of their discoveries heavy on her mind. As they reconvened, the group shared their findings. Gregory explained how he had stumbled upon a hidden cellar where remnants of dark rituals had been performed. "I found bones and remnants of past sacrifices. It was horrifying," he said, his voice trembling. "It seems the darkness here was fed by the pain and suffering of those who came before us." The gravity of their discoveries hung in the air, intertwining with the lingering shadows of the monastery. Lucia and Father Thomas, too, had uncovered disturbing truths, revealing the interconnectedness of their findings. The group's collective knowledge painted a grim picture. The darkness was not merely a ghostly presence, but a manifestation of unresolved grief and despair. They had inadvertently awakened it, and now it was up to them to confront the source of that pain, not only for the sake of the monastery, but for their own healing as well. With a renewed sense of purpose, the group made a pact to delve deeper into the heart of the darkness. They understood that their journey was about more than just liberating the spirits. It was about confronting the darkness within themselves and breaking the cycle that had bound the monastery for centuries. They would not allow fear to dictate their actions any longer. As they stood together in that ancient hall, a flicker of hope ignited within them. Each echo of the past would be met with the light they had kindled, and they would emerge victorious from the shadows. As the group prepared to confront the darkness that lingered in the monastery, an air of palpable tension hung over them. Each member felt the weight of a knowledge they had gathered, an understanding of the malevolent force that had fed on the pain of countless souls. The time had come to face this darkness, to confront the very essence of the suffering that had bound the monastery for centuries. With determination etched on their faces, they gathered in the main hall, ready to take their next steps. Father Thomas initiated the discussion, his voice steady yet filled with conviction. We must locate the source of this darkness. We've seen its effects, but now we need to understand how it manifests. Our next goal is to return to the chapel where Eleanor found the tome. There may be additional secrets hidden within its pages that could guide us. The group nodded in agreement, their resolve strengthening as they acknowledged the significance of their mission. As they made their way back to the chapel, Eleanor's heart raced. She held the ancient tome tightly, feeling an unsettling energy pulsating from it. The pages had not only revealed the history of the monastery, but had also served as a conduit for the spirits trapped within its walls. She feared what they might encounter next, but knew that this confrontation was necessary for their own salvation as well as that of the lost souls. Once they reached the chapel, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The flickering candlelight cast ominous shadows that danced across the walls, creating a surreal landscape. Eleanor placed the tome on the altar, and as she opened it once more, the air around them thickened. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching, and a shiver ran down her spine. The whispers of the past grew louder, echoing the despair and regret that had permeated the monastery for centuries. Eleanor began to read aloud from the book, her voice trembling as she recited the words inscribed within. In the depths of despair, the shadows grow. To face the darkness, one must confront the pain. Only through acceptance can the shackles of sorrow be broken. With each word, she felt a surge of energy, the very essence of the monastery resonating with her voice. The others joined in, their collective strength amplifying the power of the incantation. As they chanted, a strange phenomenon occurred. The shadows in the chapel began to writhe and twist, coiling around them like serpents. It was as if the very darkness they were trying to banish was awakening, responding to their challenge. The temperature dropped, and a chilling wind swept through the chapel, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Panic surged among the group, but Father Thomas raised his voice above the chaos. Stay together. Focus on the light within you. With his words echoing in her mind, Eleanor took a deep breath, centering herself. She envisioned the warmth of their shared purpose, the bonds they had forged in the face of adversity. It was that connection that would shield them from the encroaching shadows. In that moment, she felt a deep sense of unity with her companions, a force stronger than any darkness. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a swirling mass before them, taking on a ghastly form. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she beheld a figure shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing like embers. It was a manifestation of the malevolence they had encountered before, a physical embodiment of the pain and suffering that had festered within the monastery. "You cannot banish me." It hissed, its voice a chilling echo. "I am the essence of their anguish, the keeper of their despair. You cannot break what you cannot understand." In that moment, Eleanor realized that the entity was not just a spirit, but a reflection of the monastery's history, of the monks' desperation, their desires for power, and their failures to confront their inner demons. With newfound clarity, she understood that defeating this entity required not just strength, but empathy. They had to acknowledge the pain of those who had come before them, to offer understanding and compassion instead of fear. "Listen to us," Eleanor shouted, stepping forward, her voice cutting through the darkness. "We understand your suffering. We acknowledge the pain you've carried for centuries. But we refuse to let that pain define us. We are here to heal, to confront our own shadows, and to break the cycle of despair." Her words resonated through the chapel, and the figure faltered, the shadows flickering as if unsure how to respond. The others rallied around her, their voices joining in a chorus of understanding and acceptance. They shared their own stories of pain, of how they had battled their inner demons and emerged stronger. With each shared experience, the entity's form began to waver, the shadows weakening. The power of their collective empathy pushed against the darkness, illuminating the room with an ethereal light. As the light grew, the figure shrieked, the anguish of centuries released in a cacophony of sound. It began to dissipate, the shadows unraveling as the essence of the monks, once trapped, was finally freed. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting as the entity's hold on the monastery shattered. Eleanor felt a surge of warmth enveloping her, a sense of liberation washing over the group. In that moment, they realized that they had not just confronted the darkness of the monastery, but had also confronted their own shadows. Each member of the group understood that the journey was not merely about fighting external forces. It was about embracing the pain within themselves and allowing that understanding to guide them toward healing. The monastery, once a place of despair, had transformed into a sanctuary of light. As they emerged from the chapel, the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the world outside. The shadows had retreated, leaving behind a sense of peace that permeated the air. Eleanor looked at her companions, their faces reflecting a shared sense of triumph. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, forever changed by the experience. Together, they had not only freed the souls of the monks, but had also illuminated their own paths, proving that even the deepest shadows could not extinguish the light of compassion and understanding. As the sun rose over the monastery, casting a warm golden glow across the ancient stone walls, the air felt lighter, infused with a sense of rebirth. The previous night's confrontation with the darkness had transformed not only the physical space, but also the hearts of those who had faced it. The monastery, once a prison of despair, now stood as a testament to resilience and healing. Eleanor, Father Thomas, and their companions gathered in the courtyard, where the warmth of the sun served as a reminder of their victory over the shadows. The group took a moment to reflect on their journey. Each of them had come to the monastery seeking answers, but what they found was far more profound than they could have imagined. They had delved deep into the history of the place, uncovering the pain and sorrow that had lingered for centuries. Yet, in doing so, they had also discovered the strength of their own spirits and the power of their connections with one another. Eleanor, in particular, felt a newfound clarity. She understood that true healing required both confronting and embracing one's past. Father Thomas addressed the group, his voice filled with warmth and wisdom. "We have witnessed the impact of compassion, the strength of unity, and the importance of understanding our own shadows. The monastery is no longer a vessel of sorrow. It has become a sanctuary where healing can flourish." His words resonated deeply, reminding each member of their shared experience and the bonds they had forged amidst the trials they faced. As the group began to discuss their next steps, Eleanor felt a sense of responsibility welling within her. They had not just banished the darkness. They had an obligation to ensure that the monastery remained a place of refuge for those seeking solace. "We should open the monastery to the community," she suggested. "It can serve as a retreat for those in need, a place where individuals can come to reflect and heal, just as we did." The others eagerly agreed, recognizing the potential for the monastery to become a beacon of hope. They began to brainstorm ways to revitalize the space, envisioning programs that would allow visitors to explore their own journeys while learning from the wisdom of those who had come before them. They would create workshops focused on mindfulness, healing, and community building, turning the monastery into a hub of transformation rather than isolation. As the days turned into weeks, the group worked tirelessly to breathe new life into the monastery. They repaired the chapel, transforming it into a serene space for meditation and reflection. The once dilapidated gardens were tended to, blooming with vibrant flowers that symbolized the renewal of life. The atmosphere shifted from one of foreboding to one of warmth and acceptance, drawing people from the surrounding villages who were curious about the changes taking place. Eleanor found herself at the forefront of this transformation. Each day, she engaged with the visitors, sharing her story and encouraging others to confront their own struggles. She had become a guiding light for those seeking understanding and healing, helping them navigate their journeys in much the same way she had been guided. The friendships she had forged with Father Thomas and the others blossomed into a supportive community dedicated to nurturing the spirit of the monastery. One evening, as Eleanor reflected on the progress they had made, she felt a familiar energy in the air. It was as if the spirits of the monks who had once inhabited the monastery were watching over them, grateful for the release from their long-held suffering. She could almost hear their whispers, not of despair, but of gratitude and hope. The shadows that had once loomed large over the monastery had given way to light, and Eleanor knew that they were honoring the memories of those who had come before them by creating something beautiful. Then, in a moment of profound realization, Eleanor understood that their victory over the darkness was not an end but a continuous journey. The healing process was ongoing, and every person who walked through the monastery's doors would add their own story to its tapestry. Each individual would bring their unique experiences, and through shared stories and understanding, they would weave a narrative of resilience and hope. As time passed, the monastery flourished, drawing individuals from all walks of life who sought refuge and healing. It became a sanctuary where the past was acknowledged, but not allowed to define the future. Eleanor and her companions continued to nurture this environment, celebrating each person's journey while encouraging them to confront their shadows and embrace their authentic selves. In this way, the monastery transformed into a living testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and the human spirit. It stood as a beacon of hope for those who wandered through its doors, reminding them that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of renewal. As Eleanor gazed out over the thriving community that had emerged from the ashes of despair, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had undertaken. The shadows that once threatened to engulf them had instead illuminated the path forward, guiding them toward a brighter, more hopeful future. The dawn had arrived, and with it came the promise of endless possibilities.